Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us today for these important conversations, Climate Under Threat. This is the fourth program in our Aspiration and Resilience series, where we've been exploring the aspirations of Arab youth and why we in the United States should care. Today, the topic is climate. It's the world. It's the health of the world. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates, for making this series possible.
How did we
in an
start this
ever-connected
without an
world,
intro?
climate change is a collective threat requiring global solutions. The new administration in the United States has signaled that its intention to prioritize action on climate change and the environment. What could that signify for the Middle East, one of the most climate vulnerable parts of the world? Countries in the region that have traditionally relied on an economy supported by oil and gas are exploring post-carbon technologies and diversification of industries. What's the future of renewables in the Middle East? How do these economies reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Outside of energy initiatives, how is the region addressing overall impact on the environment? And what are the implications of climate change on security and instability in the region? And I got to tell you, it is a big deal in that region. What are youth from the region doing to mitigate further damage, and why should Americans care? We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including members of Congress, a representative of the Office of the Climate Envoy from the UAE, climate and environment experts, and many young professionals. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillClimate. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. If you experience any trouble with the live stream, they say refresh the page. It never works for me, but I hope that fixes your problem. Our first guest is a member of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. He is the co-founder of the Senate Climate Action Task Force and helped form the bipartisan Senate Oceans Caucus. Representing Rhode Island, the ocean state, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse joins us now. He's made acting on climate change and protecting the environment one of many important pillars of his tenure in the U.S. Congress. Senator Whitehouse, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just come out of the box. You know, in November of this year, we'll have the next UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Or I'm told Glasgow, so my apologies to the Glasgowians. But my question
Glaswegians.
is... there you go. My question is, what does this country need to do to get itself not only back into the Paris Climate Accords, but to become a leader, to take real steps that matter? And what are some of the other stakeholders going to do to make this Glasgow meeting something that moves us forward?
Well, the Biden administration has done a lot already by teeing up the importance of this issue, speaking about it constantly, and putting somebody who's as climate motivated as John Kerry in charge of the international side of American climate policy, teeing us up for Glasgow. So I'm very excited about what we've done so far. Unfortunately, after 4 years under the previous administration, basically under the thumb of the fossil fuel industry, we've had significant damage to our credibility. And I think it's going to be very important for Congress before the Glasgow conference to have passed significant climate legislation. And the good news is that President Biden has targeted Build Back Better, the bill that we hope to pass this summer before Glasgow, as a vehicle for very big things on climate.
You have described yourself, Senator Whitehouse, as a candle in the darkness in past years when it has come to climate action, dealing with carbon. You and I, I'm going to tell the audience, we've known each other a very long time, and I can attest that that was true. You were a candle in the darkness. Has that candle spread? Do you find that there are many more of your colleagues up there that are prioritizing this agenda in a credible way, not just a check off the box way, but in a way where they're actually going to line up with you and try to take real action?
Yeah, it's getting there. I think you see Republicans increasingly understanding that their climate denial posture was completely untenable, is completely untenable, and they're trying to figure out how to work their way through it. You've got a fossil fuel industry that is seeing the prospect of collapse and beginning to understand that managing for that is more sensible than ignoring that. And you've got Democrats, particularly those who went on the campaign trail on the presidential circuit and saw how important this was to Democratic voters and to the public. And so there's been a real rekindling of interest. But I think the most prominent thing has been the emphasis that the Biden administration has put on this. I think that has been the thing that made me feel I could step back from my regular climate speeches, and I didn't have to worry about being a candle in the darkness now that dawn was breaking.
Look, I've just finished reading Daniel Yergin's new book, in which he said Paris and that many new technologies in the renewable sector are real game changers, but that our dependence on various fossil fuels is going to remain in place for a long period of time. I'm just interested in how you think about this. There are oil and gas and coal states like New Mexico, West Virginia, Wyoming. There is an oil and gas industry out there. And today we have the United Arab Emirates, which has made a lot of its largesse in the oil and gas sector. What should we expect in terms of responsible steps where the oil and gas industry and oil and gas states and oil and gas countries, what are the kinds of steps you would expect to get them on the right side of the equation when it comes to approaching climate responsible policies?
Well, I think the first thing that those places need to do is to take a look ahead and see what they think the future of the fossil fuel industry is going to be. We've seen the leading edge of the collapse of the fossil fuel industry in coal, which is dirtier and more expensive than other fuels. We've seen a huge shakeout in the oil industry just from the pandemic, and a much bigger shakeout warned of by pretty much everybody who looks at the industry. And natural gas is not far behind, particularly with respect to its methane leakage. So if this is an industry that is headed for a cliff, then governments that are highly dependent on that industry need to be responsible about how you manage that transition. And there are ways to do it. I mean, Wyoming is basically a petro-socialist republic funded by the fossil fuel industry, but it also has enormous assets in wind and in solar if the transmission can be built to get that out onto the general grid. And places like the UAE have huge now financial footprints and service footprints and a lot of reserves built up from their past oil and gas exploration and production so that they can transition quite effectively. But if you ignore it, the danger of being caught in a really dangerous crash is very, very real. And governors in Wyoming and the Dakotas and Oklahoma and states like that, just to be responsible, they need to see that coming.
Now, you work with Senator John Barrasso and Senator Joe Manchin, who are the chair and the ranking member of the Energy and Public Works Committees, both at Wyoming and West Virginia. I sort of noticed, myself, Joe Manchin's aperture on what kinds of energy options are out there has widened. Is that your impression?
Yep.
Do you think he has got to do more? Where do you think the opportunities are with that Senate committee as you look forward?
I think he's eager to do more. First of all, I like both Joe and John very much. John I've worked with a lot across the aisle. He's very, very bright. He's a medical doctor, and I think he really wants to do the right thing. He also has the state that, as I said, is essentially funded by the fossil fuel industry. So, he's got to answer to a Wyoming legislature that is going to say, hey, wait a minute, where did all our revenues go? And he's in a position from Washington to be able to deliver for Wyoming the plan B when the inevitable crash in the fossil fuel industry takes place. And I think he's wise enough to see that possibility. And I think he's going to be cautious about protecting his home state interests, as he should be. But I think that's the conversation we need to have. How do you safely negotiate this transition and bring as many people along? How do you bring along Joe Manchin's basically massacred coal industry? How do you help those individual miners? How do you prepare the Western states for the shift that everybody knows is coming? And I think you can do it through a significant piece of climate legislation.
Sheldon, one of the things that's been most disturbing to me this past year is the politicization of mask wearing. We have a lot of young people. Part of today's program is about youth and what they should be doing. How can we keep the climate topic from following that same track that you're either, you're pro-climate or you're anti, you're pro-pollution? I'm just interested in whether you've developed any insights around youth and action and how to, essentially create a workable middle where we don't see climate politics, suffer the same fate as we've seen with mask politics?
So first, young voters and young activists have been unbelievably important in this space. They're not going away. They're going to continue to be powerful and important. So I think that's a very solid part of how we solve this. I see the politicization around climate slightly differently, because when I got to the Senate for my first 3 years, this was not a partisan issue. This didn't become a partisan issue until Citizens United let unlimited money into politics and turned the fossil fuel industry loose on Congress and allowed them to batter the Republican Party into a state of fossil fuel submission, even spooking people like John McCain, who'd run a very strong climate platform as a presidential candidate, off of the issue, and punishing members of Congress like Bob Inglis, who wouldn't bend the knee. So we're now in a position in which the rest of corporate America is starting to see the really grave harm to their business models if we don't get ahead of this. And that means that they're starting to get ready to show up in Congress and push back on the fossil fuel apparatus. And if Wall Street and big agriculture and the consumer sector and big tech show up in any kind of serious intention or intensity, then they can offset this terrible pressure from fossil fuel that has squelched bipartisanship for a decade. And the market and the warnings and the threats are starting to force that. So I think in the natural course of events, you're going to see bipartisanship begin to re-emerge. But we just got to rush it because time is really short for us.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question, Sheldon. You and I were in a conversation with a fellow from the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation, and they were looking at way you price in risk on violent weather. Incredibly interesting to me, because when you begin asking how do we go from a boutique topic to getting scale, big finance matters. Penalties essentially where risks on climate are being built into investment algorithms. I'm just interested in whether you see with sovereign wealth funds, with the Larry Finks of the world, the CFTC, do you feel that this move is substantial, or do you think it's still greenwashing?
I think it's both. There's a very substantial element to it, and that needs to grow. I think the CFTC's new climate risk group is going to be very helpful. I think the Securities and Exchange Commission moving in strongly will be very helpful. I think it's the Biden administration's intention to mobilize every financial regulatory agency to take account of this risk. And it's hard to fault them for it, because on the private side, banks and big financing entities like BlackRock are doing the exact same thing. So I think there's going to be a tectonic move in the financial sector on this that's actually overdue.
Well, look, just finally, Sheldon, when I was thinking about the filibuster debate, where that goes, I don't know if they'll change the filibuster rules or not, or whether they'll make it, such. I know I've read your comments that you have to go down on the floor and you've got to stand with your filibuster and give a speech. I actually thought it would be rather cool to hear you go down for 12 hours and talk about climate in the filibuster. Would you be willing to do that?
I could do it, and I wouldn't have to repeat myself.
Well, listen, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Steve. Good to be with you.
And listen, I just want to take a quick moment to thank the senator. We had an editor here, Erica Nidowski, who went on to work for an environmental group in Rhode Island, became very close to Senator Whitehouse. She passed away a few months ago, and the senator wrote an incredibly beautiful testimonial to her work. So thank you, Senator. Really appreciate your words and thoughts today. The United States and the United Arab Emirates are setting up a bilateral working group to advance their shared agenda, accelerate progress toward global climate goals, and contribute to regional and global sustainable development. We're joined now by Hana Al-Hashimi, the newly named director of the UAE Climate Envoy's Office. Hana, it's great to see you. I assume you're not like in Alexandria, Virginia or something. You're like way over in Abu Dhabi right now. Am I right?
Warm wishes from Dubai, Steve. It's a pleasure.
Oh, Dubai. Excuse me. I got it wrong. Well, love Dubai, too. Listen, I think that one of the things is really interesting to me is the world is going to be coming together in November for the next round of UN climate talks. The UAE has been such a powerhouse nation when it came to being a strategic, basically a vital strategic, in oil and gas. How do you think about the UAE becoming a strategic asset when it comes to renewables and to the climate change challenge?
Well, that's a great question, Steve, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you on the show. I mean, unequivocally, climate change is the defining issue of our time, and it requires a proportionate response. In the UAE, we focus very much on possibilities for the future, and we are convinced that climate action is not a burden, but an opportunity. That outlook is part of this intense, perhaps obsession of our country towards innovation and future readiness. And as noted recently, actually, by our Prime Minister, when reflecting on our 50-year history as a nation, the vision that formed us from the desert just 50 years ago has brought happiness and prosperity to our people and has taken us from our roots in the desert all the way to space with the launch of the Hope probe. So this basically is the bar that's set for us, really, from and our view from the Office of the Climate Envoy. So we're focusing very much on providing an ambitious set of options and partnerships for action, both at the macro political level and at the sectoral level that address climate change while strengthening our economy, with, of course, COP26, as you mentioned, in Glasgow, as a key point and platform that we're aiming towards. And we're very happy to be working closely as the UAE with the US government, building on many years of strong bilateral ties to tackle the global climate challenge together. Our joint efforts will not only accelerate efforts to reach climate goals, will also enhance economic opportunities and diversification while creating knowledge, skills, and jobs. To focus perhaps on what we're doing within the UAE, we have four main angles of our work and where we think we can contribute to the global dialogue. Firstly, in greater investment and deployment of renewables. So building on the fact that we currently have the world's cheapest solar and have partnered with over 40 developing countries, particularly in the Caribbean and the Pacific, on renewable energy projects, looking at scaling that up moving forward. Second, decarbonizing our oil and gas even further. Because there is still going to be a demand for decades to come. So we need to make sure that it's as low carbon as possible. We already have the lowest carbon oil in the world, but carbon capture and solar power are making it even more competitive. And we're looking at hydrogen as a new low carbon revenue source, and are happy to hear the notes from the Senator on this as a potential way moving forward for the industry. The third would be research and development. So particularly looking at ultra low carbon food and water production coming from an arid region. And fourth, perhaps advocacy, making a very visible business case for climate action from the heart of the hydrocarbon industry. We're very keen to welcome the world to the UAE and yourself, Steve, right. Absolutely anytime, and offer strong platforms for dialogue in the coming years. So basically just to wrap up and address the question. This isn't something that's new for our country. We've been working on this for 15 years and have been at the forefront of implementing groundbreaking renewable energy programs, and looking forward to working with our partners moving forward as well.
That is a terrific, comprehensive answer, because isn't it interesting? And a lot of our viewers know the UAE for a certain role, but I helped moderate with your ambassador here in Washington a session on the Mars probe and others. So science and technology that you've worked on have made a real difference. But let me ask you another thing. I often use these shows as ways to sort of talk about show and tell, because what the UAE is doing, which is standout, for you're in Dubai, the world's largest solar, really the solar park is in Dubai, and you have a city you're building, which Masdar City is going to be the region's first carbon neutral zero waste city. These are things that rich nations can do, but they become important if they're really about R&D and then finding replicable things that other parts of the world can do. So have you thought through a little bit, as you develop the cheapest solar power in the world, as you do these different things, what can be transported to Latin America, to developing parts of the world that may not have the resource base that the UAE does?
Absolutely, Steve. I think that's integral to our development philosophy and model. We're a small country, a young country, and we very much recognize that that old adage that says that if you go alone, you go slow, but if you go together, you go further. misquote.
That's about right. You know,
but
Steve Case uses that little thing in all of his books, and I keep thinking he
great
invented
quote.
it. But yeah, but go ahead.
If you go alone, you go fast. If you go together, you go far. I think
That's
we
right,
very
yeah.
much believe that. And that was core to our bid to host actually the International Renewable Energy Agency. And we've been very proud to welcome 184 member countries really to the country in order to set the renewable energy agenda moving forward. As part of that, we also launched a fund for the Caribbean and the Pacific that has looked into developing solar capacities over there. In many developing countries, Steve, it's not just a question of clean energy, but a question of access. Which empowers entire communities and individuals. And if you just think about, the access to electricity that can allow kids to study in the dark, that can allow, industries to grow in a community and bring more opportunities to people. These are really, really the kinds of empowerment that we want to continue to push forward. Maybe to give you a couple of concrete examples, we've created Mastar already 15 years ago. You mentioned the first zero carbon city in the region, and it now has a solar and wind parks in locations as diverse as the US, the UK, Uzbekistan, and Oman, as well as several other developing countries. We've brought about $1 billion in foreign aid projects for renewable energy in about 40 countries. And we have a group of very exciting projects where, that includes looking at building back better in the Caribbean. So very much looking forward to continuing really to deploy this and working with countries moving forward.
Hannah, we have a question. It's an interesting one from an intern in Senator Chris Coons' office from Ben O'Larsh. And is can renewable energy be used as a peace-building opportunity in the Middle East? You have the Abraham Accords, and that's very important. But how can a track like renewable energy options or climate or technology sharing, enhance some of what's going on in the Middle East right now?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. I think it's hard to answer it without addressing the question of climate security. I think it's important to note that very much that climate change undermines peace and security, and that applies very much in the region. There is a lot of ideological noise, but when we look at the personal level, and a person that's in a fragile country in a difficult situation, that are already losing their resources and jobs because of droughts, floods, and other disasters, there's going to be problems. So for the MENA specifically, there are many countries that are already arid, that have long histories of conflict and instability, and are already experiencing much harsher weather than in the past. I'm talking about the Sahel, Yemen, the Horn of Africa. That's where we're really seeing amplifying insecurity. So to answer the question, it's not just about the deployment of renewables is also about providing climate resilient technologies in some ways to ensure that these communities are able to remain online, to remain powered through these situations, but that we also have to deal with the adaptation and mitigation efforts to avoid fueling further instability across the region. I think there's great potential, and that in the other aspect that I think we should touch on in addition to energies certainly is agriculture technology, sort of efficient use of water as well, given the aridness of the region. And these are some of the topics that we really want to bring to the top of the political agenda, particularly as we look at our Security Council position.
Hannah, can you give me, just in final, a 30-second dummy's guide to blue hydrogen?
Well, that's a great question. It's something I'm learning about absolutely myself.
Maybe we both need it. No, I know that blue hydrogen is a big innovation that UAE is working on. That I've heard about it. That when it burns, its repository is water, as I understand it. So have been talking to General Electric and others about the promise of hydrogen and others, and so just wonder what the UAE's stakes in this are. And I may have asked you a surprise question. My apologies.
Yeah, they're absolutely welcome. This is a great discussion so far, Steve. Thank you so much for that. So blue hydrogen specifically, my understanding is that this is a way to use natural gas with carbon capture in order to produce sort of zero carbon fuel for heavy industries and transport. So there's a lot of potential. When we're looking at emissions, there's about a quarter of global emissions that come from the transport industry. A lot of that is from heavy industry, your trucks, et cetera. So when we look at alternative fuel sources, this could be potentially a game changer. It's absolutely an area of priority that we're looking at developing. It's an area, in addition to carbon capture and storage, that we're looking at deploying further domestically. And actually, just in January, we launched the Abu Dhabi Hydrogen Alliance, where we're looking at advancing low carbon, both green and blue hydrogen in emerging international markets, and hope to build that economy. The reality, though, Steve, is that this is very much an area under development. Part of the answer will depend on having markets that are ready to already use the energy as it becomes available. So there's a lot of technology still to be developed, and it's an exciting space to continue to work on moving forward.
Well, Hannah Al-Hashimeh of the Office of the UAE Climate Envoy, I look forward to, you should come back, because I think this is one, as Sheldon Whitehouse said, this is one of the most important issues where it's not just something anymore we just have to check off the box and say, okay, we're doing climate friendly things over here on Sunday afternoons, but we are actually trying to sort of embed this more deeply. And it's very clear to me that this is a priority for you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And thanks to all the viewers as well.
Joining me now are two young professionals working to raise awareness about climate change. Majid Al-Nuaimi, is the head of strategy and business development at BIA, the Middle East's fastest growing environmental management company. And Maayan Berkovitz is a climate activist and the spokeswoman for the climate team at Green Course, the largest environmental volunteer organization in Israel. Welcome to you both. It's sort of a historic meeting. I love having, chats between my friends on all sides of the Middle East. But let me start out with you, Maayan. I just want to read for my audience what your organization, Green Course, has done. It's fairly phenomenal. The promotion of the Israeli Clean Air Act, the law of polluter pays, promotion of the Coastline of Israel Act, the deposit law for recycling of bottles, on and on and on, various initiatives that your group has helped lead, and you've gotten political change in Israel. So I think many people want to sign up for how we can all learn how to get political change in Israel. But tell us a little bit about what motivated you and what had been the kind of secret sauce of Green Course's success.
Well, I can speak for myself when I say that the climate change problem in general was very close to heart, because I'm a professional tour guide in my everyday job. So I'm very close to nature, and I've witnessed firsthand a lot of the things that are happening. Working there for like 5 years, almost 5 years already, outside, outdoors every day, I can see already the effects of climate change on our nature, specifically in Israel and also in the Mediterranean area in general. So that's about me and my connection to this movement in general. So when I joined Green Course, I joined that particular group because I saw how it had its hand in everything that happens regarding the climate change movement in general in Israel. And I think the reason this organization has been so successful is because it has its hands both on the education side of it and trying to bring the real, most accurate information to the people, but also have a great connection to the government and to the Knesset, with our activists trying to do as much as they can to persuade politicians to be on our side.
Now, just before I jump to Majid, I think today there's an election in Israel, is there not?
Yeah, it is. We're still waiting on that.
And so my question is, I know this is non-scientific, but when it comes to an election, how big a priority is environmental sustainability on the minds politically inside Israel? Is it off the radar screen, or is it something people care about?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because unfortunately it has not been in the forefront of our entire political system at all. There's been a big environmental sort of movement towards this particular election, trying to bring it to the forefront, talking to the politicians, being as involved as possible with every different group going to this election, trying to get them to talk about the environment and the climate change issue. But I have to say that so far in Israel, we were facing so many different problems in all kinds of areas revolving our everyday life. So it has not yet been in the forefront as it should have been. And unfortunately, most politicians are not as aware to how life-threatening this is to all of us, specifically in our region, which is so dry to begin with. And we're expecting to have a very unfortunate and strong effect on our entire ecosystem very soon.
Thank you. Majid, your company may be the most important company I had never heard of until just a short while ago. I mean, I think, it's interesting to me to look at what you're doing as a company, kind of looking at the whole cycle of integrated waste management, renewable energy, public cleansing, the whole dimension of that and creating that. You've already got the politics in the right place as best I can tell. But in terms of making something that is an integrated ecosystem of conservation and sustainability that is climate positive as opposed to climate negative. I know that you're head of strategy and business development. Tell us a little bit about it. And is it taking hold? Because again, I'm not interested in boutiques. I'm interested in things that can be scaled or copied. And is your sense that what you're doing, which I know is a business, can be scaled and copied by others?
First of all, thank you for having me, Steve, and a very good evening from the United Arab Emirates to all of you and the viewers. As you said, BIA is an innovation leader and the pioneering force for sustainable solutions in the Middle East. It was formed as a public-private partnership company in 2007. We are based in the Emirate of Sharjah, one of the emirates that in the United Arab Emirates, which is known as the cultural capital. Our mission at BIA is to create sustainable quality of life for cities in the MENA region. And BIA has a lot of different ventures and industries that include integrated waste management, as you stated, research and innovation, renewable energy, sustainable transport, technology, and healthcare. And at BIA, we believe the biggest opportunity is to blend sustainability and digitalization to promote a sustainable quality of life. We leverage innovative technology for sustainable resource and waste management, helping to keep all products and materials in use to create positive economic and environmental and societal impact. For example, we launched, let's say, Waste Pro Plus, which is a digital solution that streamlines all aspects of waste management from collection to disposal. The data that we collect from our operations are used to inform operational efficiency and manage our resources better as well. Our fleet of vehicles also have automated route optimization, reducing the amount of time our vehicles need to spend on roads and improving our carbon footprint. We also are the first company in the Middle East to have placed an order for 50 Tesla semis, which are the electric trucks, and we will be using for long-haul waste transfers.
Well, thank you. One of the things to both of you that got me into this topic is I'm really interested in changing attitudes among the youth in the Arab world. And there's a study called the BCW study. It was really the basis of why I wanted to do this series. And what you see when you talk to young men and young women, this study talked to thousands of people, 50% men, 50% across the whole Middle East, North Africa region, is that climate really matters, technology matters, jobs matters. They don't like corruption. They're pro-faith, but don't kind of constrict, choices, make them broader. In that arena of what youth want, Mayan and then Majid, do you find this is something that is getting sticky with the youth, where that demand function is going to climb up? Maybe it's already in a good place in the UAE, but I'm just interested in how the youth see themselves as stakeholders in what is evolving in the region.
Me first?
Yes, Mayan.
Well, this is actually a really good question, because I think I can only speak for Israel, but our youth and my age and below are the ones completely pushing forward the entire operation and the whole protest. Everything that has been done for the last few years has had major backing of the youth movement. Even when we started going to the politicians one by one, the people who were in the forefront of that were the young people. We are having a very very difficult position in Israel where we're basically going in the wrong direction in our entire government actions towards this particular problem. So we're still going towards fossil fuels in most of our plans for the future, and we're going for natural gas as our main outsource instead of going towards a green, sustainable future of green energy. So the people who are in the forefront of trying to convince politicians to change policies are youth movements, mostly. That is very interesting to see as a trend in Israel. It comes from the people up.
Interesting. Majid, your thoughts on that?
First of all, thank you for the question, Steve. Environmental protection has been at the forefront of our nation, priorities, and it's a very integral part of our cultural heritage. We're lucky enough to see these, environmental programs promoted by companies in the UAE, such as BIA, Masdar, a lot of different companies that we have over here, and especially housed by, cascaded from the Prime Minister's office down to universities as well. So I think, as you said, the groundstone is there, and we've seen a lot and huge, impact that has been developed by the leadership, cascaded down to the youth, and we've seen a lot of youth advocates in the United Arab Emirates, taking climate change, environmental studies at the forefront of their studies and their daily lives. I see it happening every day. I'm proud of the youth that we have here who are very aware of the effects, of pollution, of recyclables, and it's just increasing. We're taking it step by step, and we have the, as we say, the infrastructure for it, and we're just taking it forward step by step, hopefully.
Majid, just real quick, is sustainability profitable? I mean, how do I put that? Is sustainability profitable enough to be sustainable?
I would like to extend an invitation to you to come to our waste management complex in Saj'a, in Sharjah. And, when I entered the field of BIA, I did not expect sustainability to be profitable. But when you invest in sustainability and you have the technology to take all that residue and create recyclables, we started trading in plastic, carton, metals, and different types of recyclables and material. It does to an endpoint become profitable and sustainable as well. We created a circular economy here in the United Arab Emirates, in specifically in BIA, where we deplete all the resources from the waste that we receive at our landfill, and then we start recycling it and we sell it. And one of our biggest examples is that we're opening our the first waste to energy plant in the region in Sharjah, and we plan to close our landfill hopefully by the end of 2021. And I think that's one of the biggest milestones that we're achieving here in the United Arab Emirates, to be the first in the region. And we're gonna hopefully cap our landfill, diversify our sources of renewable energy, and I think it's a great step forward, hopefully.
Well, let me just ask just very quickly, Mayan and Majid, we have a question here from Ted Spickler. He's a volunteer at the Citizens Climate Lobby, and he writes, what assistance do Middle Eastern countries need from the United States? I'm going to modify that and say, just really quickly, what might you need from the United States? But then I'd say, what technology? I was just using Waymo to get here today, which is an Israeli, Tel Aviv company. I mean, there's so many great innovations. What innovations do you have? Do you think we might want to take over here? But Mayan, your quick thoughts, and then we'll go to Majid and we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Well, I think that what Israel needs, I'll answer both. What Israel needs most from the U.S. is basically to help us back the right horse, because at the moment, the U.S. is backing Israel's transition towards fossil fuel gas and trying to be a crossroad for oil and gas towards Europe. And at the moment, it gives us a lot of legitimacy to go through that path and not pursue more sustainable energies. So that is something we need from you to take action and be on the right side of history with us. Secondly, the thing we can contribute to other people is that Israel has always been in the forefront of technology in many, many different places and in high tech. So I guess the minute we put our best people on it, and at the moment we are trying to make progress when it comes to batteries and storing of energy made by solar systems. So the minute we'll be done with that, and at the moment there is progress being done in that area, I assume that's something we could export to the world.
Majid, your quick thoughts?
So I would say, thankfully, due to leadership that we have at our company at BIA, we recently exported the model that we have here to, Saudi Arabia, Medina, and we are creating another BIA over there. By the way, BIA means environment. And we also are operating, hopefully, in the new administrative capital of Cairo. Our model proved to be successful. The technology that we use at our landfills and the route optimizations that we use for waste management is very, promising. So I think maybe we can try to share the knowledge that we have in terms of what we're doing over here in the Middle East. But just to answer your first question as well, I think sustainability and looking at the future is something that always requires a collective action. Always a helping hand is something that we will take and we'll never say no to.
Well, listen, I want to thank you both. It's been a really high quality, interesting conversation. We should continue it sometime. But Maayan Berkovitz, climate activist, Green Course in Israel, and Majid Al-Nuaimi, head of business strategy and business for BEA in Sharjah, United Arab Emirates. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Joining me now is the former co-chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm delighted to welcome Congressman Yvette Clarke, who represents the 9th Congressional District of New York. Congresswoman, it's great to see you. I always enjoy our conversations. I want to know, as I was talking to Sheldon Whitehouse earlier, what does our country need to kind of do to get beyond talking about what we need to do on climate and actually doing serious things, particularly as we approach a new round of UN climate talks in November?
Well, first of all, thanks. It's great to be back with you once again, Steve. There's a lot that is being discussed right now on Capitol Hill, and we're looking at moving forward as part of our recovery on infrastructure.
Right.
And I think that creates the greatest opportunity for us to address what we know is an existential threat to our nation, and that's climate change. The climate crisis demands that we do immediate and bold action, and the need to transition to a clean economy is fueled by clean energy and generates millions of new jobs and from electricity and transportation. So there's a lot that we can be doing right now. Those conversations have begun to take place. Members recognize that a 21st century infrastructure really means resiliency. It means that we have to be good stewards, and that means addressing climate change, which is with us.
One of the conversations I had recently was very intriguing. It was with former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz. And he's had, sort of looking at an energy jobs coalition, so that as we look at the future of infrastructure, we look at the future of climate change policies, and we look at the fact that a lot of people need jobs during a time of transition in this crisis. Is there any serious talk about that? I mean, it almost has a kind of works progress administration feel. If you're going to rewire this country, why not put a lot of people to work in the process of doing that? Is that part of the conversation?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the bottom line to it is this is the next industrial age for the United States of America. We run the wheels off the rails on the infrastructure of the 19th and 20th century. The current conditions mean that we have to bring our infrastructure up to snuff with the realities of how we live our lives in the 21st century. One of those ways is we've all had to, due to the pandemic, adopt and adapt to a virtual life basically overnight. And that adoption and adaptability has only been able to touch a portion of our population. There parts of this country where we have what we call broadband deserts. There's work to be done in that space. That means employment. That means infrastructure. We can go down the line, ways in which we need to shore up our energy grid. We saw what happened with Texas. The once in 100 year occurrence created a massive and cascading disaster in the midst of a disaster. And so we know that the investment we make right now will, first of all, new industry will emerge as a result of that investment. Work that must be done to strengthen our ability to deliver clean energy and build out infrastructure for clean energy is a must. That creates jobs, that creates entrepreneurship and opportunity. And also knowing that we've got to maintain this, again, is an industry. Everything that we do to build out the United States of America, it pays for itself in the long run, because it creates much more productivity among the American people. It gives more access to more remote locations, be they rural or suburban, to other avenues for opportunity and for work. It's a win-win. And we are certainly looking at that because, quite frankly, we're in the midst of a pandemic. And if that hasn't been life-altering to all Americans, let alone globally, then something within us is a bit off kilter. We've got to turn the page on this pandemic, and in so doing, turn the page on all of these existential threats that have been laid bare by the fact that, again, we've had to rapidly adapt to a virtual life. We recognize that without a clean energy source going forward, the carbon that we spew from these legacy industries, it is only going to compound the challenges that this generation and generations to come will face.
Representative Clark, President Joe Biden has said that he wants this infrastructure bill to have bipartisan support. We're hearing rumors it's upwards of potentially $3 trillion. When you begin spending money and authorizing money out there, a lot of folks know that that's going to make a major impact across the nation. Do you think there is enough common overlap between the parties right now that we can get a bipartisan infrastructure bill that deals with climate?
Yeah, we're having a lot of those discussions now. And as a matter of fact, we just did a hearing on the LIFT Act just yesterday in the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's going to take some conversation. You have to remember that there are certain energy sectors that have meant a lot of wealth to certain parts of the country, have meant a delivery of energy to other parts of the country that has been seamless for a generation or more. We know that this transition is going to be challenging. And so the challenge for us is to, build up a workforce, retrain a workforce, orient a workforce to taking on the new positions of the 21st century, and working with colleagues to get to that win-win place where we can make sure that we can get bipartisan support for the work that has to happen going forward. We're beginning to see some recognition of the crises before us, particularly with respect to climate, the costly nature of it in terms of lives, livelihood, property. And so I anticipate that it's going to take more conversation, but I think that the door isn't shut to that conversation. And as long as that door is open, we can come to an agreement.
Well, I just want to, just for the record, give credit to Ryan White, who's the Deputy Director of the U.S. Institute of Peace, for that question on bipartisanship. I saw it on my notes in it. Your question, thanks for asking, Congressman. But let me, ask you just a I don't know how to ask this, but I'm going to try. I think that if you look back at American history and big transportation infrastructure decisions, for a lot of Americans, they were great. They worked. For a lot of other Americans, they were marginalized, they were pushed aside, they were left behind. If you talk to Anthony Fox, our former Secretary of Transportation, he would talk about we need to undo a lot of that unfairness that got baked in to large-scale American infrastructure. And I guess the question I have for you is, are we at a point after the George Floyd murder, after the stress we've seen on inequality, on race in this country, is fairness, are you confident that fairness is going to be baked into the future? Or are your antenna still up, red flags, worried about that? Is that a fair question?
It is a fair question, and I'm confident and red flags. So I just believe that, we know what we know now. The data's in, the information about the inequities of our society have been laid bare, and we have an opportunity to change course, to create fairness and equity within everything that we do, touching every community across this nation, particularly the most vulnerable who have actually paid the most dear price with respect to this pandemic. I know that members of Congress on both sides of the Hill, both in the Senate and the House, have given recognition to this. Now it's up to us to do the work. It's up to us to prevail, not only at the federal level, but where the rubber meets the road in our state legislatures, as well as our municipalities. It's critical for us to move forward, baking into policy, righting the imbalance, the inequity that has left so many impoverished and vulnerable in our society. And I think this is the opportune moment to lift that up and to write that course.
Well, Representative Yvette Clarke, who is chair of the Homeland Cybersecurity Infrastructure Protection and Innovation Subcommittee, really appreciate it. Let's have another deep dive on cybersecurity and innovation. That would be another good 20 minutes to spend together. But thank you so much, as always, for joining us.
Absolutely. And, cyber is tied to infrastructure as well. As our systems become more and more technologically advanced, we have to make sure that we protect our critical infrastructure. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to that deep dive.
Really look forward to it. Thank you so much, Congresswoman.
My
next guests are experts in climate, energy, and sustainable buildings. Jennifer Gordon is the managing editor and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Sarah Al-Batouti is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. In 2014, Sarah was appointed as a senior advisor to the Egyptian president. We were just discussing this a moment ago, focusing on sustainable community development. Really appreciate you both joining us. This has been a cool day. I mean, I've been learning a lot about blue hydrogen and youth activism across the Middle East, like the whole Middle East. Let me just start with you, Jennifer. You tweeted, I follow you on Twitter, as you know, and you say, next Thursday, we're going to co-host a first-of-a-kind model COP26 with our partners, UK and the USA and University of Kansas. This is going to allow student negotiators and observers an up-close look into the exciting world of climate diplomacy. I love this kind of climate diplomacy. So what are you, I know you're talking to these people already, but what do you think their angles are going to be in a climate diplomacy simulation? And is it going to show up the real COP26?
Thank you so much, Steve. That's a great question. So we're doing this program this week that is kind of, if you think about what Model UN is, right, where you have these teams of students who are young and motivated and interested and engaged. And so we've put together similar teams, but on climate. And so each team will have to prepare its own country brief. We have 7 countries, I believe, represented by these student teams. And we as the Atlantic Council staff will be the facilitators of this conversation. And we'll see what happens if we can reach our climate goals through this event on Thursday.
That's very interesting. Are you going to send any of them to the real Glasgow meetings?
We'll see. We're hoping that we can all go by then.
Oh, that would be fun. Sarah, let me ask you, one of the things that often gets neglected is the talk about how many emissions and our conservation problem by way of buildings, architecture, the way we design communities. I become fairly obsessed with it because not only have we had the LEED building certification issue in the United States, but now LEED is trying to look at, what does a healthy community look like? What are the different dimensions of that? And environmental impact and sustainability are very high on that radar, on that screen for them. So tell us, you're an architect. And I have never thought about the questions about what's going on globally. I've been more obsessed about what's happening in DC here in town. But what do you think the opportunities and obstacles are in bringing architecture and building management and construction into the climate conversation?
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for posing this question. So if we look at the overall picture, basically, the reason why we were given an opportunity to plunge into this conversation was because of the Paris Agreement. And one of the pillars of the Paris Agreement discusses housing, which is basically all buildings, anywhere, people spend 90% of their time. And now with COVID, we're spending more time in spaces. And so what people want out of the spaces they occupy is not just engineering excellence, it's a lifestyle and it's being healthy. And it's also providing equity for people living in spaces that are not providing good health. So as architects, it's no longer traditional to just build something that looks good, stays within the budget, and then you work on the construction site. You're actually rethinking about what these buildings contribute to the health and the lifestyle and the general well-being of those who are in it. So around the world, of course, LEED discusses this and it has rating systems, but around the world, what's happening now is that climate change integration is playing a bigger role in the built environment. And because of that, there are internal and national rating systems that are coming up, which are tailored and made for the climate needs and the wants, on a national level. And that's a very exciting thing to do because it makes green buildings and it makes buildings more accessible and attainable and culturally more relevant to each continent in one sense.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you both, and try not to muck this up, but I actually do invent some questions here. But I want to ask you, one of the things we were just talking to Majid from a company called Bea, and he's got some operations actually in Cairo now. But one of the big changes, whether you're looking at carbon sequestration, or you're looking at renewables, or you're looking at moving from coal to other forms of energy sources, and everyone thinks, okay, that's good. But the growth in India, the growth in China, the growth in certain developing nations, which is very, very rapid. People don't understand how rapid developing nation growth is. Sometimes outstrips supply. It outstrips the ability to pay for it. And so there is this view that sometimes rich nations can have these debates about climate and renewables. Poor nations cannot. I'm interested from you, both Jennifer and Sarah, what are the things we need to put in place to bridge technology, innovation, and development to the developing world so that cost and price and doesn't become a factor when we're talking about the global fishbowl? Jennifer?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So, I think that when we tend to think about whether it's in a developing country or, in a developed country, when we think that there's this price differential between something that is, a fossil fuel versus something that is cleaner or better for the environment, I want to stress that that's a policy choice.
Right.
And I think that we need to make sure that we reverse that policy and that we make, that we incentivize the use of the thing that is in fact better for the environment. And we need to do that globally. And I think too, that when we think about, if we're sitting in the United States and we think about other places in the world, and why should we care? Why should we help decarbonize an energy system on the other side of the world? Ultimately, when it comes to climate change, I think, we sink or swim together. And so we need to make sure that what we put in place in the United States is, that we are looking for global solutions to decarbonization worldwide, that's every bit as important. And I know you had another part of the question. I think you were asking about different technologies. And I think when you look globally at clean energy technology, something that works on, and that's appropriate, for one grid may be different. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking, for every answer to this problem. And finally, I will say that I think we need to take an all of the above clean energy approach. So, sometimes that might be carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Sometimes it might be clean hydrogen. Sometimes it might be nuclear reactors. There are a number of different ways of getting to zero, and I think that we need to look at all of them.
Sarah, what are your thoughts on how do you bridge that dimension if you think it needs to be bridged?
I think it definitely needs to be bridged, but I also think that we shouldn't underestimate the wealth of indigenous knowledge. And in the Middle East, there are many, many intelligent ways where, from our ancestries that have adapted and mitigated risks to their livelihoods, especially the livelihood that is tied to agriculture, the livelihood that is tied to water resources. And therefore, it would be a very smart way of adapting the technology that is, the West are leaders in this. There's the technologies moving forward, the education systems are, and the awareness is far ahead. However, what we need to do is to make it very accessible and user-friendly for the culture. This is the way that we will absorb this. So instead of localizing only what we know, we need to integrate foreign technology, use it here, localize it in our own smart way, find solutions that are digestible to society and to culture. Because, there's so much that is going on that the most important thing, I think, for climate change to really become mainstream is our ability to channel what we know of forecasting. What is going to happen, with our water resources, with our increased heat, with our population growth. So these are things that we know, and now we have to integrate them in how the policy, as Jennifer was saying, the policy has to be one that is current, but also one that is continuously working out to adapting these foreign ways of thinking and how we can interpret them here in North Africa, in the Middle East, and in Egypt. And this is why the first step is to really look at where the emissions are coming from in terms of the industries, the agriculture, and also the housing sector, which is the fastest growing market. And so it's all about integrating, ideas into policy and making it accessible to people where it's fairly new.
Look, we've only got a minute left, and we're going to talk to the Undersecretary General on climate and environment in a moment. But I want to ask you both real quickly. I've talked to, I don't know what we call him, Senator, Secretary John Kerry a number of times on climate, and he always said that, Copenhagen wasn't enough. We need more. What would be success and what would be failure, if you could give me short form, in Glasgow, both of you? Jennifer?
So I think that every country obviously needs to, we have to up and increase our ambition when it comes to climate, when it comes to COP26. And then I think we also really need to have very concrete steps in place to getting there. Because it's one thing to say, we're going to be net zero by 2050, or, to make a pledge, that is similar to that. But I think, going really sector by sector and saying, this is how we're going to address the electricity sector. This is how we're going to address heavy industry, and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm hoping to see later on this year.
Sarah, thank you, Jennifer. Sarah?
I'm hoping that definitely this year we are talking more about awareness and education, and also showing roadmaps, as Jennifer was saying, sector by sector. The other thing is to really take the lessons learned from COVID and to understand that we need to push for equality in terms of how we move forward with such important policy. And to create the heroes, to show the project, to really provide a platform in every single sector of the heroes that are doing changes for climate change and really put them out there for people to learn from and to expose these great examples in all of the different sectors, not just activism, but there's so much that's being done. And I think the whole world needs to hear about it. And the next meeting in Glasgow should be showcasing that anyone can take part in climate change, and it should become the norm.
I'll make a deal with you both. If, around the time that Glasgow is happening, I'd love to have you both back. Sarah, are you in Cairo now?
Yes.
Amazing. So your foreign minister, Shukri, used to be ambassador from Egypt to Washington, D.C. And years ago, we used to talk about climate. Many, many years ago, climate change would be needed. And I'm just going to put a challenge to Egypt that I don't think many people expect what they just heard from you. I don't think they expect a nation with as many challenges as Egypt making positive contributions on the global stage when it comes to climate. It's a great story, and I hope you'll both come back and tell us about it. And if Egypt, sometimes small countries are the ones that make a difference. So and Egypt is not a small country, of course, but it's an underappreciated country in terms of this. And I really appreciate your thoughts today, and would love to have you back. Maybe we can get Foreign Minister Shukri to join us. But thank you so much for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
To close out our program, as I've mentioned, today I'm very pleased to welcome the Undersecretary General of the UN and Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. Inger Andersen has more than 3 decades of experience in international development economics and environmental sustainability, specializing in the Middle East and Northern Africa. She's normally in Nairobi. I think she's in Copenhagen right now. Madam Undersecretary General, it's really great to see you. One time I moderated a forum kind of looking at the next 75 years of the United Nations. And I had something like 6 or 7 undersecretaries and the president of the council and Ban Ki-moon. There were about 9 people on the panel. We got it done in an hour. But I did not have you. I would have loved to have spent the whole hour with you. So tell us, you have a very interesting role and job, which is really to be the conscience of the world when it comes to thinking about how the world can do better on environment. What are the highest priorities you have? I know water is one. Tell us about that. But what are some of the agenda items right now of your office?
Well, at this time, and thank you for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure. And just call me Inga, please. That's much better. At any rate, at this time when we really, and this show, of course, is focusing on climate change, which is an existential crisis. We're talking about 3 planetary crises in the context of the United Nations: the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. And why do we have these crises? What has happened to bring them about? It is us. It is the human beings. It is our unsustainable consumption, our unsustainable production. We take stuff out of the environment. We put it into the economy. That's a fine thing. But then we discard it back into the environment as CO2 emissions, as waste, as destroyed forest, as lost species. And we are assuming that harvest will follow harvest, that rain will come when it's supposed to come, that the tides will be as they are, that the fish will be where they've always come, that the migratory birds will be where they are, and that pollinators will pollinate our crops. We're assuming that what we refer to as the Earth systems will remain stable. And that assumption is quite something, because at this point, we've put more carbon into the atmosphere than we've seen in 800,000 years. And so in these last 3 million years, we've seen temperature differences on 2 degrees only. Now, that's extraordinary because we've had the Ice Age and everything else, but 2 degrees. So what is that then, when today we know that we are at 1.2 degrees already, and we want to keep it at 1.5. That is the story here. So yes, the 3 crises: climate, nature, and pollution and waste. But right now, obviously, all eyes are on climate, and that's, of course, what your show right now is also about. Right. And I've heard, I was sort of listening to some of the other talk, and there's, tremendous amount of energy now in this topic, I think. So I really do thank you for pushing it out there in Washington, D.C. over at this time.
I think it's my privilege, my honor to do that with you, but I also really appreciate the synergy of these challenges as you talked about them. And I'm going to go ahead to a question we got, because we have the former Secretary of Agriculture as a good friend, Dan Glickman, who sent a note to me, and he said, Steve, and he wanted me to pose it. He says, over 70% of the world's fresh water is used today to irrigate crops and feed animals. If it's even higher in the developing world, imagine that only 30% then is left for the world's water for everything else. Dramatic weather changes are heightening the drought flood cycle worldwide, and this will all affect the ability to feed the world sustainably. So, I'm interested in, this is another dimension which I think fits into your construct. But I think that sometimes people, we saw what happened in Cape Town, South Africa. We see that cities can run into this. We know that water is part of the equation there. But in terms of the moving picture, I guess my question is, what do we need to do to not only get grassroots understanding of there, but to get governments to take action to preempt some of these nightmare scenarios, such as Dan just shared?
I mean, obviously, first of all, we need to take climate action, because part of why we're seeing these increasing droughts, part of why we understand that those areas that are already arid will, in all likelihood, based on science projections, be experiencing greater and more frequent droughts, and therefore be under even greater stress. So we need to deal with climate now. But at the same time, and as the secretary asked, obviously we have countries that are in extreme water stress right now. And we need to understand that is something that we then need to think about. How is it? Is it because we have destroyed the surrounding environment, and therefore are there ways that we can mediate and remediate that? Yes, to an extent, because a local hydrological cycle has been disrupted due to desertification and land degradation. So there is an opportunity, therefore, to restore land, to restore ecosystems to a degree. These are still arid lands. I'm not talking about the complete aridity, but the agricultural lands of Iraq and Syria and Jordan and Yemen. Now, they have been destroyed due to, obviously, conflict, etc., due to over-extraction, and due to lack of management and so on. But also, if we can regenerate, and Americans know this from the Dust Bowl. Americans know that you can bring, or from Tennessee Valley as an example, you can bring degraded and destroyed lands back to life. But it takes some investments and it takes stability. So at the same time, we need to be sure that we don't over-extract from the groundwater resources. And that's a real problem, because we tend to over-extract when we don't have the rains, and if we do not have enough storage. And of course, there's a global issue around food, and this is that we waste so much food. If food waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter on this good earth. So thinking about how we deal, store, move, and ensure that food is used and not wasted. And then, of course, thinking about water use efficiency. How much crop per drop are we producing? How much evaporation is there? Can we do drip irrigation? These are some of the answers that we need to tackle.
I very much liked my last guest commenting from Egypt. Sarah said, don't underestimate indigenous innovation in this area, which I think is a very important point. But I also know that part of the big challenge is to get the big population, big landmass countries aligned. And so those would be, I'll just make, solve Europe's problems. Let's just call Europe a country. The United States, Brazil, India, China. And I'll ask you the unfair question, which I know you can't do, which is to grade each of them on how much they're leaning in on this. But because I know you can't answer that, let me ask, what opportunities do you see in Brazil, or what frustrations do you see when it comes to getting the world's biggest landmass, largest population countries aligned? Because that will create surround sound with a lot of the other nations in the world, I suspect.
Look, we are not living in a world where everybody is in agreement, right? So but corner solutions is not going to get us anywhere. And what we need to understand is that climate change is coming. If we thought COVID was bad, climate change is so much worse. COVID is a little overture compared to that complete disruption of the Earth systems as we know it. So What is really good is that the US is coming back in a leadership position at the political level. I will say, though, large parts of the US economy never left Paris. Many states did not leave Paris. Many companies did not leave Paris, and certainly many citizens did not. And of course, we need to understand this at the same time that the issue of equity is real, right? Very poor countries are very hydrocarbon dependent. And how are we going to support them? We can't just say, look, 600 million Africans don't have access at all to electricity. Too bad, you can't use if you're sitting on a pile of hydrocarbons. You can't say that unless we treat this with solidarity, which is why climate finance was part of the deal, is part of the deal. You've got to help these countries get energy online and use that to leapfrog into the non-polluting age of energy. And when it comes to tropical forests, and your reference to either the Congo Basin, to Indonesia, to Brazil, clearly these are the lungs of the earth, right? But at the same time, you have very poor people living in some of these basins. And again, we need to have solidarity. We need to support these countries. We cannot sit back and say, well, we just want you to make sure that these forest stands remain, and so that we live fine and dandy in our big cities. We've got to think with these poorer nations how we can support them. And I think that that's a conversation we are having. And certainly that's what we need to see at Glasgow, where at this time, what we need to see, we've got 126 countries that are signed up for net zero. That means that by 2050, they will have net zero emissions. But even with that, and even on the assumption that the US comes into the net zero club, which has been part of President Biden's election platform, we will still be at 2.5 to 2.6 degrees. So we got to stretch. And that's what Glasgow has to be. We need to go further, faster, with clear time-marked actions.
Inger, real quick last question. We've been looking at new technologies developed in the Middle East, Israel, UAE, other countries. Are they on the map? Can they make a difference in the climate change story?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, Israel has done some really great work on precision agriculture, precision irrigation. We heard the UAE, they've built that whole new city. They started companies, and they're really seeking to lean in. Now, they are a hydrocarbon dependent economy, but they have also seen, and I think we heard that from Senator Whitehouse. Look, coal was the first sunset sector, but other hydrocarbon sectors are coming. So diversification matters, and matters greatly, so that we leave no one behind. And that's part of what we need to do. So yes, there are real solutions. And aridity does not mean necessarily that you cannot diversify, have extraordinary economies, reach for literally Mars. And so I think that it is all about innovation and re-engineering the thinking, because we do not have the steam engine anymore. We do not have, we are moving forward, and using technology will be part and parcel of the solution.
Well, Undersecretary General of the United Nations, Inger Andersen, Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. I'm hoping to try to figure out how to get over to Glasgow or around there, one of these things happens. So maybe we'll be able to meet in person. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates in Washington, D.C. for its support of this program and these conversations, and all of you in the audience for joining us. For those of you who missed any of the conversations, we'll have all of this up on our website shortly. You can check them all out there. They're worth it. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.